Do you remember that white dress? The one still soaked, like it was never removed from the last body that wore it. You're back on Whisper Horror Channel, where every unfinished story has a price to end. Last time, we witnessed a family trapped between the memories of the living and the fury of the dead. But tonight, the truth rises from the marsh. Lily Cromwell will no longer dream. She will confront and stitch back every piece of soul that's been torn apart. But, is something still waiting to be threaded? If you're ready to hear whispers from places no one dares to tell, like to keep your heartbeat steady, share so you don't remember alone, and subscribe, because sometimes the scariest thing is when the memory no longer belongs to you. The next morning, Lily woke up late. The attic remained sealed as if it had never been opened. No ashes, no burnt fabric, no cassette, no chest, just an old, dusty room with a forgotten toy box. And her memory was empty. She didn't remember why her sleeve smelled of smoke. Didn't remember why her wrist ached every time she touched cold water. Didn't remember why, suddenly, upon seeing a tiny porcelain button fall out of her pocket, her eyes welled up. Daniel noticed. Not the difference, but the silence. Elise used to be this silent. Celestine too. He didn't ask. He just observed. And when Lily returned from school, he quietly opened the attic. The room was empty. But beneath the floorboards near the window, he found a faint gray streak, like fragmented ash left over from a fire no one lit. That evening, Lily drew. She didn't know why she chose black pencil and a gray background. Her hand moved purely by instinct. She drew an empty room, in the middle of which was a faceless, hairless, featureless figure, created only by overlapping pencil strokes, each new line covering the previous one. She stopped. And unconsciously, she breathed out a sentence. I won't be like anyone, anymore. Then she startled. That sentence didn't sound like it came from a child. 3 days later, something strange happened in town. At the elementary school, a younger boy named Max suddenly couldn't speak anymore. Doctors found no biological damage, his vocal cords were intact. But Max wouldn't open his mouth. He didn't cry, didn't moan. He just sat and drew. And all the boy drew were faceless figures, wrapped in cloth, their mouths sewn shut with silver thread like steel wire. His teacher asked, "Who are you drawing, Max?" The boy scribbled on the edge of the drawing with a pencil. "That person's name is L. But it's not me." At the same time, at home, Lily dreamed. She saw herself standing on a misty swamp bank, holding a half-burnt spool of silver thread. In front of her, not a doll, but herself, made of ash. She raised the spool, intending to sew up the crack in the chest of the ash self. Then from behind, her own voice spoke up. "If you sew it up, you will remember. If you burn it, you will no longer be you. Choose." She dropped the spool to the ground, woke up abruptly. The next morning, Elise found her daughter sitting by the window, the sunlight shining through her hair creating strange white streaks. On the floor was a crumpled drawing, but Elise picked it up. The drawing showed a child with a sewn mouth, tightly holding a tiny porcelain button with the letters E.C. Elise asked softly, "What did you dream about?" Lily didn't answer immediately. She looked at her mother, then asked back, Have you ever seen what you burned still leave smoke in your head? Elise didn't answer right away. Lily's question, seemingly vague, hit upon something she had buried deep for over 10 years. Something never told to Daniel. Never recorded in a diary. Never named as a loss. In 2009, Elise was pregnant for the first time. They named the fetus Juniper, a neutral name, not because they wanted to hide the gender, but because they both believed the baby would choose its own identity. But at the 13th week, Elise woke up in the middle of the night with a pain like someone had hollowed her out. Blood gushed like a stream. The hospital called it miscarriage, unexplained miscarriage. But what silenced Elise even more was the ultrasound result 3 days earlier, the last time she saw the embryo, which showed there were 2 heartbeats. No doctor could explain why a single gestational sac had 2 independent heartbeats. They called it an artifact, signal interference. Elise called it by another name. One she had believed since childhood. Dual memory. Now, looking at Lily sitting silently by the window, clutching the porcelain button engraved with E.C., Elise knew her daughter was not haunted, but rather sharing a part. She walked over, gently placed her hand on Lily's shoulder. "Daughter, if there is something that doesn't belong to you. When I was in the hospital, at that time, I thought someone was humming a lullaby to a child who was never born." Lily placed her hand on her chest. If that part of the memory comes back, not to harm me, but just to live on, would you let it stay? Elise didn't speak. But she held her daughter's hand, and for the first time, in a single moment, a second heartbeat resonated through her skin. That evening, while Lily and Elise were cleaning the kitchen, Daniel went upstairs to find some old documents to prepare for his winter geography class. He opened the wooden cabinet, flipping through compartments containing files, birth certificates, and letters. And then, at the bottom of a deep drawer, he found a small reddish-brown leather notebook, tied with a short ribbon, the kind Elise used to record fashion design sketches before Lily was born. He opened the notebook. The first part contained dress patterns, cuts, and measurements. But in the middle of the notebook, on an unlabeled page, a series of drawings in black pencil appeared. They didn't look like designs. They looked more like psychological drawings, chaotic, vague, full of hidden meanings. And in the middle, there was a page that made Daniel freeze. A pair of thin hands, holding a silver needle. Sewing together small body parts. Head. Chest. Hands. Legs. Each part had a name written in a childish script, a script that wasn't Elise's. Not Lily's. At the bottom of the page was a signature. Small, slanted, as if signed by the hand of a first grader. Juniper C. Daniel sat down on the bed. His hands trembled. Not out of fear, but because another kind of memory within him was also starting to wake up. He remembered the night Elise lost her first child, the night she whispered in her sleep, calling a name he thought was only subconscious. "June, don't let anyone sew you up." He closed the notebook, but didn't put it back. He brought it downstairs to the kitchen, placing it in front of his wife. Elise looked at it, flipping through the pages, to the last drawing. She didn't cry. Didn't panic. Just nodded. "That's it?" Daniel asked softly. "Do you think it's coming back, through Lily?" Elise didn't answer immediately. She turned to her daughter, who was sitting and drawing a new image. A swamp. A burning figure. And a streak of ash flying across the setting sun. "It's not coming back," she said. "It's never left." 4 days later, on a gloomy morning, as drizzle fell silently through the Cromwell house window, a man appeared at the gate. He wore a knee-length leather coat, carrying an old oak suitcase with rusted copper edges. His face was ashen, with a small scar running from his left temple down to his chin, not deep, but sharp like a half-finished silver stitch. Daniel looked through the window, feeling uneasy. He went to open the door. "Hello," the man said in a hoarse voice, with an old Appalachian accent. "My name is Silas Thorne, keeper of folk ritual records at the American Institute of Folklore. I need to speak with someone named Lily Celestine Cromwell." Daniel paused. "What did you say?" Silas bowed slightly, then placed the suitcase down. "Your grandchild, or your daughter, if you are Daniel Cromwell, has left an imprint. It matches a record from 1913, in the collection of the 13th Call. And I am here, because that voice has just returned to our archive. But on a wax cylinder." Elise stepped out from inside. "A wax cylinder? Those stopped being produced nearly a century ago." Silas nodded. "Exactly. But what terrified us is that when we played the only intact recording, the voice on the cylinder was that of a child. A little girl. And she clearly spoke her name, Lily Cromwell." The whole family fell silent. Daniel didn't believe it. Elise knew. She stepped back, clutching her collar. Silas opened the suitcase. Inside was an antique player with a wax needle. He turned it on, and the cylinder's sound began to echo. "The 13th day of the 10th month. I sewed my eyes shut before they saw me. I burned my hands before they made me draw. And I left this voice, because I know I will return, in another form. If anyone hears this voice, find the white porcelain button. It is the only eye that hasn't been sewn shut. My name is Lily Celestine Cromwell. And I am not the first time." The wax cylinder player stopped with a dry click. The Cromwell kitchen was dead silent. Lily stood behind the staircase, half her body hidden in shadow, but her eyes wide open, as if her soul was trying to suppress something, or had just been activated by the voice on the cylinder. Silas gently closed the player, then placed his hand on the wooden suitcase. "I found this recording," he said, "in an underground vault beneath the old convent of the Thread Keepers, a group of non-religious nuns, living in seclusion since 1882 in the Waverly area. Their job was not to pray, but rather, to remember the parts of the soul that were never born. Entities not strong enough to become ghosts, and not weak enough to vanish." Daniel interrupted. "You mean, like a lost fetus?" Silas nodded slowly. "And also, forms that were imagined long enough, or loved deeply enough, to form a layer of extradermal memory. No bones, no blood. But they have sound, they have form." Elise clenched her sleeve. But how could Lily speak in that voice, in a recording from 1913? Silas took a hand-drawn map from the suitcase, yellowed paper, broken edges, smeared ink. In the middle was a double spiral symbol, 2 threads intertwined but never touching. Below the symbol was a Latin phrase written by hand. "Memoria nascendi," the memory of the unborn. He pointed to the symbol. This is the symbol of the thread keepers. However, 4 days ago, when I reviewed the psychological survey records of adolescents in the Tranquil Hollow Lake area, I saw a copy of this image, redrawn with watercolors, in a child's hand, signed, Lily Cromwell. 3 years old. Daniel and Elise looked at each other. Elise remembered one of Lily's first drawings. She had taped it to the refrigerator. A blue and white double spiral, which she thought was a lollipop. She quietly went upstairs, into her daughter's art storage room. A few minutes later, she brought down a crumpled old drawing, kindergarten wallpaper. In the middle of the drawing was the exact same symbol. Blue and white pencil. The bottom corner was written in shaky cursive, L.C. Silas looked. Nodded. Memory doesn't need to be remembered by the brain. It can cross time through blood, through eyes, or through an object that has never burned. And I fear. This girl is holding what the thread keepers once called the thread of echo, something that once made a child in 1901. So her own mouth shut to stop hearing herself from the future. Silas placed the map down, his gaze resting on Lily. The girl still hadn't said a word since the recording ended. But it wasn't out of fear. Not out of panic. But something deeper. Like a remembering. He gently tilted his head, asking, Lily, do you keep something made of porcelain, small and round, like a button, perhaps engraved with letters? The girl blinked. Then nodded slowly. Without speaking. Elise leaned forward. Honey, I thought you threw it away. Lily didn't answer, just turned around, rummaging in her jacket pocket. The white porcelain button appeared in her tiny palm. It had a faint crack on the back, and exactly as Silas described. The letters E.C. faintly engraved by hand, the lines uneven. Appearing centuries old. Silas reached out, very gently, as if afraid of breaking it. When he touched it, he closed his eyes. Then, a moment later, opened them and said, This is a sonic conduit. We call it a sonic reliquary, a sound relic. It doesn't contain a soul. It contains a layer of sound waves that have been sewn up. It doesn't emit sound outwardly, but can be activated if it meets the right host. Daniel frowned. You mean the button can replay memories? Like a recording device? Silas smiled faintly. A recording device stores physical sound. This stores the intention at the moment of passing, the last words that person wanted to say, but didn't have time to. It only plays when the person touching it has the same soul rhythm. And I believe Lily is the thread connecting the person who created the button and the person who needs to hear it. He took out a small brass earpiece. Attached it to a wire connected to a handheld resonator. Can you place your hand here? Silas offered it to Lily. The girl looked at Elise. Elise nodded. Lily placed her hand into the small brass ring. Click. The button emitted a very faint hiss. Then, from within, not Lily's voice, but a woman's voice. Young. Tired. Like whispering through the wind. If anyone still holds a part of themselves, don't sew it up. Burn it. And sow the ashes into the eyes, to forget the way back. Elise, if you hear this, then your second child is not a baby. It is a memory template, embroidered from your own torn part. And when it starts to sew itself, you must cut. Lily pulled her hand back. The button went silent. Elise retreated, covering her mouth. Daniel was stunned. Silas bowed his head, his voice deepening. I fear, this is not just a story about a curse, but a spiritual legacy sown incorrectly. And only the person who carries their voice from another life can undo the stitches. That evening, after Silas left, taking the wooden suitcase and an incomplete warning, the Cromwell house returned to its usual quiet, but it was no longer peaceful. Lily sat alone in her drawing room. In front of her was a new sketchbook. She had torn out all the old pages, burned them, and buried the ashes under the tree behind the house. But her left hand still trembled. She tried holding the pencil with her right hand. The lines were soft, loose, shaky as if she were learning to write. Then she switched to her left hand. Immediately, the image appeared, without thinking. A pair of eyes sewn shut. A mouth gaping open with a needle dangling. A young arm, sewing up its remaining wrist. She dropped the pencil. Elise walked in. Didn't speak. Just looked at her daughter. I heard her voice again. Lily whispered. Not with my ears. With my hands. Elise sat down next to her. Who is she, Lily? The girl blinked. I think she's Juniper. But, now she calls herself the half-stitched fragment. And she's angry. Not angry at me, but angry because she was burned. Twice. Elise trembled. You know, about the first time? Lily nodded. I saw it in a dream. You were standing in the attic. Your hand was holding a wooden box. Inside was a piece of fabric, half burnt. It smelled of young skin. There was a name you didn't call. But that fabric, when it burned, it sang. Daniel walked in from the hallway, just as Elise burst into tears. I don't know what to do. She's no longer our daughter. Daniel looked at Lily. No. She is still our daughter. But inside her, there is a part of us we never dared to keep. And now, it's returning to demand to be remembered. That night, Lily had a different dream. She saw a hand made of ash, reaching up from the swamp, offering her a burnt spool of silver thread. Juniper's voice echoed. If you sew it up, I will be silent. But if you burn me again, next time I won't come back alone. Lily opened her eyes. Her left hand was stained with charcoal. And on the table was a drawing that had never appeared before, a little girl sewing her own image into someone else's skin. 3 days later, a parcel wrapped in rough paper arrived from an unknown address, only handwritten on the back. St. Archive Echoes, Greenmount Hollow. Daniel carefully opened it. Inside was a hard cardboard envelope, an old ivory paper printed with a typewriter, and a rare cassette tape, the kind used for internal transmission rituals among closed monastic orders. The paper bore the title, The Ritual of the Silent Thread Cutting. A simple, yet cruel, guide. The original keeper, the seed-bearer, the one who carried or created the memory fragment, must cut the thread themselves with an object belonging to them, blood, hair, or final breath. The thread, usually hidden in an intermediary object like a button, wrapped fabric, or tangled hair, will materialize through the light of damp incense and ash wax powder. When it appears, the person performing the ritual must recite the dissolution phrase. What I once held, I no longer accept. What was once skin, I no longer name. Ash, fly away. Thread, do not connect. If the thread does not dissolve, it proves the memory has entered the body. In that case, the ritual fails. The host must choose, either live with it, or let it complete its unfinished action. Daniel finished reading, looking at Elise. Elise said nothing, just picked up the paper, her hand trembling slightly. So, no one can do this but me. Because I am the only one who ever allowed it to exist, even just in thought. That night, they followed the instructions. Lily was put to sleep, her room covered in mirrors and black fabric. As a form of spiritual isolation, Elise placed the EC porcelain button in the middle of a small circle of ash, sprinkling melted wax powder from the accompanying candle. In her hand was a clump of hair she had shed from giving birth to Lily. She had kept it as a small memento. She recited the dissolution phrase. What I once held, I no longer accept. What was once skin, I no longer name. Ash, fly away. Thread, do not connect. The candlelight flickered. The button cracked in two. From within, a thread as thin as silver hair emerged, twisting. Then burning. No smoke. No smell. Only a small hiss, like the sound of someone catching their breath when they stop dreaming. At that exact moment, Lily opened her eyes. She didn't scream. Didn't panic. Just breathed deeply, and for the first time in days, her left hand no longer trembled. The next morning, Elise found her daughter sitting on the porch, holding a white notebook. Redrawing the swamp scene. What are you drawing? Elise asked. Lily smiled softly. I'm drawing the dress floating away. No one is wearing it anymore. 2 weeks after the silent thread-cutting ritual, life at the Cromwell house gradually returned to a normal rhythm. Lily ate well, slept soundly, and notably, no longer sleepwalked. Her drawings became brighter, colors returned to her art, no longer gray or fragmented silver threads. Elise, although not completely at ease, also began to feel relieved. Daniel frequently returned to teaching at the university, maintaining a sufficient distance between work and memory. However, the swamp was not yet quiet. That morning, when the sunlight was still slanting through the trees, Daniel was sweeping leaves on the porch when he saw a man standing on the far bank of the swamp. He wore an old brown long coat, a hood, carrying nothing but a stick and a small backpack. The strange thing was, he stood for a very long time, motionless, as if waiting for something to emerge from the water's surface. Daniel paused. Something felt very familiar. He walked closer, across the grass, to the path near the swamp when the man turned around. And Daniel took a step back. On his neck, there was a long scar in the shape of a double spiral, very similar to the Threadkeeper's symbol. But this scar was not new. It looked as if it had been sewn up, and then undone. Hello. Daniel spoke, trying to remain calm. Are you a traveler? The man shook his head. I am the one who was called. Called by whom? He smiled, but his eyes were lifeless. I don't remember. I just know I woke up in the forest, and there was a voice in my head. A child's voice. Named Juniper. Daniel didn't tell Elise immediately. But throughout that afternoon, his mind felt as if something had just been released, a loose memory, once sealed by silence. It was the gaze, or rather, the empty human-like shape that he had seen once, in Lily's unfinished sketch, months before the incident occurred. He retrieved his daughter's old art folder from the cabinet. Page 7, right corner, had a charcoal drawing. A man standing in a circle of ash, holding a stick with a flaming tip, a spiral thread mark on his neck. And a blank face, only his eyes were closed. Below the drawing, he's not the first, but he remembers the first. Daniel brought the drawing downstairs, placing it in front of Elise. Do you remember this picture? Elise nodded slowly, her tension evident. Lily said, she drew it in a dream. But she didn't draw it with her hand, she copied the image so she wouldn't forget. I thought it was a product of imagination. Daniel clenched the edge of the table. The man I saw this morning is exactly the man in the drawing. Not a single detail is wrong. That evening, they had Lily sit in the living room. Honey, Elise began gently. You once told me. Juniper is no longer coming back. But do you still hear anything? Lily looked at her parents. Then nodded, but without fear. I don't hear her. But I know, she sent someone back. Because she said, there is still a part of the voice that hasn't been remembered. What voice? Daniel asked. She said, I have been cut, but my father, what my father once believed, still has a thread that hasn't been pulled out. Silence filled the room. Daniel exhaled. Elise stood up abruptly, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled out an old notebook, notes from when Daniel was a graduate student researching post-Civil War American folklore. She opened it to a page pinned with a rusty pin. The page was written in faded ink. The Gray Thread Cult, a group of wandering believers from the South, who believed that life begins with a sacred thread tied between the tongue and the heart. If the thread breaks, the person forgets. But if the thread twists, they remember something that doesn't belong to them. Daniel was stunned. I used to study this group, but thought it was a legend. Now I understand. Elise looked directly into her husband's eyes. No. You didn't just study. You met them. You believed in them. Even if only for a short time. And I think, that was the moment, you left a twisted thread. The next afternoon, Daniel went alone. He wore his old coat, left his phone at home, and brought only the old notebook and a pencil. He knew exactly where to go. The western bank of the swamp, where the water was still as glass and there were no waves, where, according to the locals, no sound echoed back if you shouted. He arrived and saw the strange man still standing there. Are you waiting for me? Daniel asked. The man nodded. Very slowly. Not you. I am waiting for your memory. It's about to return. Daniel sat down on a rotten tree stump nearby. Do you know who I am? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he bent down, picked up a small stone, and used his fingernail to draw a double spiral on the ground. You are the one who once sewed a sentence shut, then forgot it. Now, I have come to return it. Daniel felt his chest tighten. What sentence? The man raised his head, his eyes expressionless, but his lips began to mouth a very familiar sentence. My child was not born. But it knows I once intended to say. I wish you had never been a thought. I didn't say it in time. But the thread holding that sentence twisted, and remained. Daniel was stunned. He backed away, sinking to the ground. A memory exploded in his head, a rainy night in Louisiana. While he was an archaeology student, Daniel participated in a field research group on folk beliefs. While drunk, he and a girl, Lydia, performed an oral ritual, sowing a soul without a name, so that if it exists, it will only appear to the one who conceived it without taking responsibility. He had never thought of it as real. But now, he understood that the twisted thread that Lily carried wasn't just from Elise. It was the part Daniel had sown and forgotten. The man walked over, sitting next to Daniel. "I am the remembered part that was pulled from you. I have no name. I only carry the voice that you once thought in your head. And now, you must choose. Either accept it back, or let me find someone else to remember it instead." Daniel spoke softly, his voice hoarse. "If I accept it back, what will happen?" The man tilted his head. "You will hear the sentence you never dared to say. And the girl will no longer have to remember it for you." Daniel remained silent for a long time. The ground beneath his back was damp and cold. Vapor rising from the swamp like thin smoke leaking from the mouth of a drowned, undissolved body. The man remained there, motionless as a living stone pillar, and between them, there was only a dry dust spiral in the shape of a thread being undone. "How do I hear it?" Daniel asked, his voice low like a confession. The man didn't answer with his mouth. Instead, he pulled a small piece of fabric from his collar, stained brown, crudely hand-stitched around the edges, with a small black thread speck in the middle like a dead mole. "Place it on your heart. If you are the one who once uttered this voice in your mind, the fabric will stick. If not, it will fall." Daniel took the piece of fabric with both hands. Slowly. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but because something inside him was twisting, like a worm awakened from ash. He placed it in the center of his chest. It stuck. No glue needed. No blood needed. It stuck as if his heart had called it back. And at that moment, a small explosion like cracking bone echoed. A black thread line seeped from his chest, splitting in two, running up his neck, forming a double spiral, but this time, the spirals were not tight. They seemed stretched by a force that had been sealed, and was now returning. Daniel collapsed onto his knees, his hands trembling, his eyes wide open. His mouth began to move, uncontrollably. "I never thought I could be a father. I never wanted to keep anything like you. But I once thought you could be a door back to my kindness." It was a part of his memory he had never dared to name. One night at the archaeological camp, Lydia, the girl from the group, told him she was pregnant. He was drunk. He got angry. He said something, then immediately took it back. He no longer remembered what he said. But, the very thought of, "I wish it had never been anything," unintentionally sewed a voice shut. Not Lydia's voice, but the voice that hadn't yet formed, the voice of a being that never had the chance to be born. The strange man bowed his head. Now it knows what it once was, and why it never got to have a real body. Daniel choked up. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." "You don't need to mean to. Just be real enough. And you were real enough to create a spiral. Lily was just a space empty enough for that thread to enter." Daniel shed tears. For the first time in many years. "What can I do to fix it?" The stranger looked up at the sky. You cannot. But you can retell it. Not to your wife. Not to your daughter. But to the thread. You must give it a real ending, so it no longer seeks another form to remember through. Daniel looked back at the fabric stuck to his chest. Retell, what does that mean? The man replied. Write down the voice you sewed shut. And end by letting it dissolve, not connect. That is the only way for a threadling, an unformed memory creature, not to grow into resentment. Daniel returned home at dusk. He didn't say a word. Didn't ask his wife. Didn't touch his daughter. He went straight upstairs, into his study, and locked the door. On the desk was the old notebook, the blunt pencil, and a blank page, like the void in his heart for the past decade. He placed the fabric with the black thread aside, opened the notebook, and began to write. Not about the unborn child, but about the emotions he had buried. About the escape. About the cowardice. About the blind anger when Lydia told him she was pregnant. He remembered what he said, not with words, but with his eyes. I thought, if she disappears, I will be myself again. I thought, if that pregnancy is real, then my life is over. But I never said, I'm sorry. When Daniel's pencil began to tremble, the twisted thread mark on his left chest throbbed, rhythmically, like another heartbeat beating in reverse. He slumped onto the desk. Not from exhaustion, but because he heard a voice, young, small, belonging to no one alive. Dad could have called me by name. But Dad chose to call me the thing that should have been. I'm not angry. I just don't want to be a borrowed shadow forever. At the same time, downstairs, Lily stopped in the middle of a drawing stroke. Elise looked at her daughter, seeing her hand go limp. Her eyes gazed afar, as if watching an image withdrawing from her head. What's wrong? Elise asked. Lily whispered. I don't see anything anymore. The shadow in the mirror is gone. And my hand no longer remembers what I shouldn't remember. In the hallway mirror, the image that used to be distorted, where it once reflected the shadow of a woman in a white dress with silver thread sewn around her neck, was now just the blurred light of the ceiling lamp. No one stood there anymore. Daniel wrote to the final line. I do not ask for forgiveness. But I write this so that it no longer has to find someone else to be remembered. If that voice was once real, then now, it has been named by the only thing I can give. Its presence in the story I no longer avoid. He put the pen down. The thread mark on his chest faded. It didn't dissolve, didn't burn, it just retracted, and turned into a silent mole right next to his heart. The next morning, before the sun fully shone into the kitchen window, Elise heard a knock at the door. Not loud, not hurried, just 3 beats, even, gentle. Like the habit of someone who never wanted to wake anyone up. She opened the door. There was no one. Only a white envelope placed on the small wooden chair. No sender name. No postmark. Only a very small symbol in the left corner, a double spiral, but the thread line was broken. She opened the envelope. Inside was a piece of white fabric, carefully folded. No button attached. No dye. No thread. Just fabric, pristine, clean, and without memory. And included was a single line handwritten in pale purple ink, in a slanted script. Now it is wind. No longer thread. And no one has to keep it anymore. Elise walked inside, calling Daniel and Lily. They sat around the table, touching the piece of fabric. Lily asked softly, "Can I keep it, Mom?" Elise nodded. "Now it's just fabric. You can embroider anything you want on it. No one is demanding memories back anymore." That evening, Lily cut the fabric into a small piece, sewed it into a mini flag hanging above her bed, and embroidered a simple image. 3 people standing on the bank of the swamp, holding hands. Above them, there was no thread. Only a swirling wind rising into the sky. In the hallway mirror, one last time, the white shadow reappeared. But this time, she didn't look at Lily. She just nodded. Then stepped straight through the glass, like someone walking out of a dream no longer called back. The story seemed to have ended, but when the wind changed direction, and an object no longer carrying memory suddenly found a new owner, then the only thing that keeps us safe is not to embroider with old threads. Greenmount Hollow is a small town in northern Maine, more than 300 miles away from the Cromwell swamp, where there is only one gas station, one church, and a dilapidated old tape store behind the pharmacy. The town has forgotten time. But time has not forgotten the town. Wednesday, September 17th, 6:12 a.m. Isaiah, the keeper of the Baptist Church's archives for over 30 years, walked into the old cassette storage room, as usual. He intended to reorganize a batch of old tapes that the previous priest had recorded, mostly scattered sermons from 1910 to 1980, stored for archival purposes. No one listened to them anymore. But that day, he found a tape without a label. Only one line written faintly in pencil. "Memory of the thread, sent back to the wind." Isaiah was curious. He turned on the tape player. A hiss. Then, a voice echoed. Not a man's voice. Not an old person's voice. But a little girl's voice, clear, yet dreamy. "I am the dress that was never sewn completely. I am the whisper that my mother didn't dare to write down. I am the sound of the needle falling into the ash, then taking root from the swamp." Isaiah stood up abruptly. His face was pale. That voice couldn't be here. It couldn't belong to an old tape from the 70s. He ran straight to the new priest's office, Jacob Evermore, a young man who had taken over the congregation less than 2 years ago. "Father, you have to hear this immediately." Isaiah handed him the tape, his hand trembling. Jacob turned on the player. After listening for less than 40 seconds, he turned it off. "Whose voice is that girl's?" Isaiah replied, almost whispering. "I don't know, but I think it wasn't recorded here, but was sent here." Father Jacob Evermore, who graduated in theology and ancient languages, immediately recognized a few details. The phrase, "dress that was never sewn completely," is an ancient metaphor in the thread-keeper ritual in the South. The phrase, "sound of the needle taking root from the swamp," was recorded in a collection of Louisiana folk documents, where a group of believers believed that abandoned memories would return as voices, if no one bothered to remember them. Father Jacob Evermore began to investigate. And the first thing he found was the voice on the tape matched 97% with a recent recording, a ghost story video posted on YouTube called Whisper Horror Channel. The character, a little girl named Lily Cromwell. 3 days later, on a gray, heavily clouded afternoon, an old pickup truck stopped in front of the Cromwell house gate. Daniel was fixing the back window when he heard a gentle horn. Elise stepped out from inside, still holding a kitchen towel. A tall, thin man, dark coat, a wooden rosary around his wrist, stepped out. "Sorry for coming unannounced. I am Father Jacob Evermore, from the Greenmount Hollow congregation. I need to talk about your daughter." Daniel stiffened. Elise looked at her husband, then invited the priest inside. They sat at the dining table, which had been the center of confusion, and now were about to face a question they were unprepared for. Father Jacob placed a cassette tape on the table, old, with peeling leather casing. "I found it in our church archive. There is no date on the tape, but the voice on the tape, I believe, is Lily's." Daniel looked at Elise. She nodded slightly, then called her daughter. Lily walked in, still with paint stains on her sleeve. When Father Jacob opened the tape and played the first segment, the room fell into absolute silence. Lily's voice echoed, clear, but like an echo from the bottom of a well. "If I am the fabric, then who is the needle? If I am the unthreaded word, then who started the first thread?" Elise gripped her daughter's hand. Daniel bowed his head. And Lily didn't show surprise. She just quietly said, "That's my voice. But I don't remember saying that. Unless someone took my dream and retold it for me." Father Jacob took notes of every word. "Perhaps it is an echo from unfinished memory, what ancient texts call echo of the unclaimed thread. A voice that hasn't lived correctly will find the closest structure to reside in." Lily looked up. "So it can borrow someone's voice to be heard?" "Not borrow, my child," Jacob said. "It uses dreams to sew itself back together. And if no one undoes the thread, sooner or later, it will become a complete fabric of something that never existed." Elise asked, her voice trembling, "Do you mean our daughter might be possessed by another voice?" Jacob shook his head. "Not possessed, but inherited. Because in the final segment of the tape, that voice says something." He fast-forwarded to the end of the tape. The little girl's voice whispered, but this time, with a fracture. "They stopped the dream. But I have copied enough. And I will weave the shape back with the very silence they left behind." Daniel gasped. Elise wrapped her arms around Lily, who had started losing small patches of hair 2 weeks ago. For no apparent reason, Father Jacob stood up. "I will not leave until I am sure that voice is no longer demanding Lily to be its form. To do that, we must go to the place where that voice was first woven. Not in Daniel's mind, but in the original ritual, where the first thread was sewn, and then hidden in the wind. 15 years ago. In the western swamp area of Louisiana, a place not on the map, there existed a summer archaeological camp called Project Heron. Founded by a group of Yale University students and independent researchers. They studied lost folk rituals, rituals not found in books, only passed down through memory. Daniel had been one of them. Now, he was returning, not to excavate, but to undo a thread. Jacob's SUV slid on the bumpy dirt road. Elise sat in the back seat. Holding Lily tightly, the girl had been silent for over 48 hours. No fever. No sickness. But her eyes no longer reflected light as before. It was as if her eyes were listening to something else from somewhere very far away. "The wind here doesn't make a sound anymore," Lily whispered. Jacob glanced at Daniel. That is the first sign. Upon arrival, all that remained of the archaeological camp were 3 dilapidated foundations, a collapsed tent, and a wooden sign with faded letters. But Daniel still remembered. He led the group to a circular patch of land, located behind a willow tree, where 15 years ago they had performed the threadkeeper's mock ritual, the mock sewing game, as they called it. Back then, it was just an experiment. A ritual taken from Creole legend: write something no one wants to remember on a piece of paper, sew it into a piece of fabric, and bury it in a place without wind, so it won't spread. Daniel hadn't buried it. He burned it. And now, that ash had taken root. Lily stood in the middle of the circular patch of ground. She didn't speak. She just bowed her head, then began to repeat every sentence from the tape, in the exact voice, but without emotion. I am the fabric. I am the thing my mother never named. I am the sound of the needle in the mouth of the ash. I am the mark of a memory that doesn't want to die alone. Jacob immediately pulled a sacred hemp thread ring from his pocket, not to bind, but to close the circle of wind. He placed it around Lily and Elise. Don't move. The girl is not possessed. She is being pulled back to the position of something that never existed. And only the person who started that thread can tell it to stop. Daniel stepped back, took a deep breath, then stood in his old position from years ago, by the round stone where he had burned the first piece of fabric. He began to speak. Not a prayer. Not a plea. Just a retelling, complete, truthful. Without twisting, without adding or subtracting. I once wrote something down. That I didn't want that thing to take form. I burned it. I thought the wind would forget. But I forgot that ash knows how to cling. And memory doesn't need a name, it just needs a structure. Just then, the first gentle breeze in years swept across the swamp. Not strong, but it carried the smell of ash, old smells, and the faint laughter of a child, like an echo from inside a rotten tree trunk. Jacob shouted. Now, name it. Don't let it be the nothing. Give it a name, even if just to bid farewell. Daniel looked up. His tears fell, for the second time in his life. If you were ever something in me, I name you Asher. Not to keep, but to send off. 3 days later, the Cromwell family returned to their house near the swamp. Lily woke up, for the first time in weeks, with clear eyes. She no longer talked about dreams. No longer drew twisted figures. Elise and Daniel whispered to each other every evening, grateful that the seemingly endless nightmare had passed. Jacob slept temporarily in the living room. He intended to leave the next day, but a small detail held him back. When he opened the box containing the old tape to note down the time, it was no longer there. Only a piece of paper folded into 3. Not ordinary paper, but a piece of white fabric pressed into a page, as if someone had learned to write with fabric. On it was a single line in black ink. Asher is wind. But who will sew the sound of the wind into words, if not those who have heard it? Jacob felt something very small but terrifying. Words now didn't need a voice. They needed ears accustomed to fear. He quietly walked out to the swamp early in the morning. When he reached the bank, where Daniel had seen the man standing in the distance, Jacob placed the piece of fabric under the tree, and reread the lines that were written. Asher is wind. But if the wind knows how to find thread, it surely knows how to find paper. The wind swept by, carrying a wordless sound, like a small laugh torn from a sigh. At the same time, Lily in the drawing room suddenly felt her throat itch. She turned around, took a blank piece of paper. Her hand moved, but not according to her will. Lightly, evenly, as if someone was embroidering words with a borrowed finger. After 10 minutes, a passage appeared on the paper. I am not Asher. I am the voice after. I am the one who remembers Asher enough to not let it rest. Elise walked in, saw the paper. She hugged her daughter, whispering, "No one will use you to remember what should have dissolved. If it still seeks, I will learn how to hold the thread. And the wind will not find the fabric frame anymore." That night, Jacob stayed awake. He didn't pray. He just wrote, recording a new ceiling structure, a way to identify which sounds are from unsettled memory, and which sounds are fake, sewn from repetition. He named it the second sonic thread. 3 months later, at an orphanage in Appalachia, West Virginia, where nameless, unclaimed children are raised in silence, something strange began to happen. 8 children, aged 6 to 10, for 3 consecutive days, simultaneously drew the same shape. Not a person, not a letter, but a double spiral pattern with lines twisting like threads, but the starting point always broken. They called it the handless sewer. The center's manager, Mrs. Ruth Lannister, a Baptist and former art teacher, noticed this coincidence. She asked each child, "Where did you learn this shape?" "I saw it in a dream." "Who taught you to draw it?" "No one taught me." "It is something next to my ear, speaking in the wind." The third child, a 7-year-old boy named Miles, had a high fever that night. When the doctor came to check him, he was not conscious. But his mouth mumbled a passage that sounded like a prayer, in a language no one understood. Strangely, when recorded and analyzed by software, that voice matched 96% with the Whisper Horror Channel tape, the voice of Lily Cromwell. But no one had ever shown the children the video. No computers. No internet. The next night, security cameras recorded all 8 children sitting in the dark of the common room, each holding a piece of fabric, torn from a bedsheet, and sewing themselves with empty hands. They had no needles, no thread, but the fabric still tore into shape. When Mrs. Ruth intervened, the children didn't react. They still looked in the same direction, where there was nothing but a white wall. Only one little girl spoke softly. "That person doesn't need hands. That person uses memory to sew. And now that person is asking, who will return the name that you burned?" 3 days after the handless sewing night, Mrs. Ruth Lannister, after many sleepless nights and advice from the local pastor, sent an urgent report to a little-known organization, the Archive of Peripheral Echoes, AP. A group specializing in studying phenomena related to mysterious sound waves, fragmented memory, and non-physical signals that affect group psychology. Within 72 hours, 2 senior members of the organization arrived at the Appalachia orphanage. Dr. Everett Ross, an expert on the language of unrecorded memory. Nina Voss, a symbolic archaeologist, who had studied nonverbal signals in Louisiana folk rituals. They started with the common room ceiling, where the camera recorded the phenomenon of the children sewing invisibly. When examined closely with UV light and surface fiber analysis equipment, Nina discovered a faint embroidered pattern, previously covered with white plaster. She gently peeled off each layer. What appeared beneath was a large spiral, 97% identical to the broken thread pattern that Lily Cromwell had drawn in Part 14. In the middle of the pattern, in ash ink, was a line written in ancient Gothic script. Asher never left. Asher is just learning how to sew the air back together. Dr. Ross's hand trembled as he read the last line. Air, here, is not literal, but the silence between two memories. Something that Asher, if it is a memory entity, is trying to sew back together, to form a self-recollection. A memory that lives by its own ability to be repeated. They began to interview each child. The fifth child, named B, 6 years old, suddenly said something that made the whole team hold their breath. Asher has no shape, but he likes the shape of people who make mistakes the most. The handless sewer is not a ghost. It is someone's mistake who didn't remember clearly enough. Nina Voss suddenly understood. This is no longer a haunting. This is a form of transmission, not through blood, but through the memory stream. Those who have heard, dreamed, or written down Asher, whether intentionally or unintentionally, all left an open thread. And Asher, although no longer having a voice, is still learning to use those very silences to weave its shape back. As night fell over the Appalachia Mountains, Dr. Ross and Nina Voss sat in a temporary office at the orphanage, reviewing all the audio data from their recording equipment. Using sound layer analysis software, Ross discovered a terrifying detail. Every time a child said the word Asher, a similar oscillation pattern appeared in the background sound, like the faint sound of a needle touching the surface of the fabric. Not noise. Not a recording error. But a regular structure, like a code embroidered with waves. Ross reopened the podcast geolocation data tracking software, a system that archives encoded audio files uploaded by Whisper Horror Channel but not publicly released. The truth stunned both of them. An initial recording of Lily, an unedited episode, in which she whispered along the spiral shape, was mistakenly sent to an automated podcast platform for the visually impaired in the southeastern United States. From there, it was periodically broadcast during nap time at least 3 orphanages in the Appalachia Shelter Cluster System. No one intentionally broadcast it, but people still listened. And those who listened were all children without original memories, without names, and without anyone telling them stories. They listened. And Asher used that very void to embroider his shape. Nina slammed her hand on the table. This is no longer memory. This is memory parasitism. Ross pulled out his notebook, recording the term. Parasitic recall structure, PRS. A form of information that carries no content, but regenerates by being remembered incorrectly. At the same time, at the second orphanage, Wayford Home, a little girl named Zoe, who had never learned to read, suddenly used a pencil to draw a passage on the wall that exactly resembled Asher's Stage 2 shape, a spiral with a long thread tail, ending with a shape of a bleeding ear. Zoe didn't know who Asher was, didn't know how to read, didn't listen to podcasts. But when asked, "Who taught you to draw this?" Zoe replied, "Not a person. It's the wind. The wind of the name that was burned." 3 days later, Ross and Nina stood outside the production office of Whisper Horror Channel. located discreetly on the third floor of an old building in Salem, Massachusetts. No sign. No doorbell. Only a blurred glass window with a small line of text. Those who whisper must also listen. Inside. The editorial team was reviewing an archive of hundreds of unreleased raw tapes, where Asher's voice was unintentionally uploaded to the public podcast system. Ross presented. We didn't come to stop it, but to correct what was sown incorrectly. What we are facing is not a physical entity, but the shape of a sequence of errors that is regenerating itself through incomplete memory. Nina continued. If the original of memory is fabric, then the correct retelling is the knife that undoes the thread. We need Whisper to release an episode that has never been. Decoding the entire structure of Asher's memory, from beginning to end, without embellishment, without sensationalism, without fictional narration. After hours of debate, the team agreed. They called this broadcast The Original Stitch. That evening, the special episode was broadcast live on podcast platforms and YouTube. No background music. No horror effects. Just a slow, deep reading voice, recreating exactly every detail that happened to the Cromwell family. Elise and Daniel. Lily and the sketches. The ownerless tape. And every piece that led to Asher. Within 24 hours, the special broadcast attracted over 2.5 million listens. But the surprising thing was not that, but rather, at all three orphanages where the Asher drawing phenomenon occurred, all the drawings automatically began to fade, as if being unstitched. At Wayford Home, little Zoe woke up in the middle of the night, ran to the wall and used her hand to erase every drawing she had created. She didn't cry. Didn't fear. She just said, I remembered wrong. It wasn't like that. Asher is part of sadness. But not every sadness wants to exist forever. Ross whispered. Memory is undone. It doesn't disappear. But it no longer demands a shape. 12 years later, Lily Cromwell, now a 21-year-old young woman, lives secluded in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. She avoids the media, doesn't use social media, and never mentions the years that were filled by the invisible thread named Asher. She works at a small sewing studio, specializing in vintage restoration, where wedding dresses, handkerchiefs, or even bed sheets carrying the marks of time, are unstitched one by one, mended stitch by stitch, and returned to their original beauty. This very job, unsewing the wrong to restore the right, is how Lily soothes the haunting that never left her. One afternoon in March, when Portland was still drizzling rain and the wind carried the smell of cold pine, Lily received an anonymous package. The outside was simply labeled, Return of the pattern. No return address. No postmark. Inside was a strange piece of fabric, neither old nor new, ivory-colored, feeling like human skin that had cooled after a fever. On it was a single stitch line. A spiral shape. Starting from the center, but with no end point. Only one end of the thread, and a line written in gray thread. Asher is not reclaiming the voice. Asher is waiting for the frame. Lily felt a chill down her spine. She knew exactly what that meant. The frame is where memory is fixed. If Asher was once a floating memory, now, someone is trying to pin it into shape. She called the only person who still held the original data, Nina Voss, now retired, living in Seattle. Nina took the call at midnight. Her voice was shaky but alert. You must burn it immediately. Don't keep it. Don't study it. An incomplete piece of fabric is an open invitation. If Asher was never fully drawn, then this is someone trying to continue weaving with someone else's hand. But Lily couldn't throw it away. She tried folding it, but each time she folded, the stitch line shifted a few millimeters, as if the fabric was changing its own dimension. She placed it on the table, looking at it for a long time. Then wrote a single line on a piece of paper. I am no longer the child who doesn't remember. I remember. And I will not re-embroider what was once wrong. She placed the paper next to the fabric. Turned on the light. Left the room. The next morning, Lily walked into the small sewing studio as usual. In that place, early morning always smelled of old fabric, light glue, and sunlight streaming through the blurred glass, a dim light that always made her feel safe. But today, she stopped dead in her tracks. The piece of fabric was gone. No one had a key to the room last night. No signs of disturbance. Only an old wooden embroidery hoop, broken at one corner. Placed right in the middle of the workbench, where she hadn't placed anything last night. On the hoop was a solitary thread, winding along a small curve, stopping at an unfinished point. Like someone was embroidering, then stopped midway, or was cut off. Below it was a small piece of paper, with no writing, only a fingerprint printed in black thread. Not ink. Not printed. It was thread embroidery, forming a fingerprint as if drawn with invisible thread. Lily picked up the embroidery hoop. Her hand touched the final stitch. And as soon as her finger touched that unfinished thread, she heard the sound of the wind. Not real wind, but the kind of wind that only echoes in the ears. The first sound that echoed was not Asher. Not childish. Not deep. But the voice of another child, female, nasal, very faint. He doesn't want to come back. But someone else wants him to stay. I am not Asher. But I am the one who undoes the thread without permission. She froze. Stepped back. It was no longer memory resurfacing, but memory being forced to live again in another form. The voice in her ear continued. How many people heard, but didn't stop it? How many hands trembled, but didn't undo the thread? They are being called, not to sew, but to undo the part that was never embroidered. Lily knew what that meant. Asher was no longer a memory. Now, Asher was a verb, an action, of souls that refused to dissolve. Using the very people who were once silent to pull themselves back. On the wall of the studio, where she used to hang a map of ancient embroidery patterns, a new spiral appeared. Not drawn. Not embroidered. Only water stains, gradually spreading from inside the brick wall, taking shape exactly according to the unfinished thread on the hoop. That evening, Lily reopened the old laptop. Something she hadn't touched for 3 years, since she left all online platforms. No password, no email. Only one page always appeared when the machine opened. Whisper Horror Channel, the original stitch. Below the video was a pinned comment from an anonymous user 3 weeks ago. The final stitch belongs to no one yet, but the first one to undo it is still alive. The username was Suture_Jacob. Jacob Hawthorne, the paranormal sound researcher, who had helped Whisper decode the Asher memory phenomenon that year, and had disappeared from the radar since the last episode aired. No one knew where he went. Only that he had sent a final handwritten letter to Nina Voss, with the line, "I will step into that structure to know if a memory can be undone. Then whether the one who undoes it can still keep themselves." Lily hesitated, but finally sent a single message through the old platform. "Do you still remember Asher? If you were the first to undo it, then why am I holding the embroidery hoop?" Who continued the thread? The message was marked "Seen" in exactly 11 seconds. No reply. Only an audio file segment was sent back. No title. No clear format. But when Lily opened it, the first sound was not Jacob's voice, but her own voice, at age 9. A segment she had never recorded, never remembered saying, "I won't sew. I won't draw. But if someone else does, will I stay silent?" Jacob's voice echoed after that, deeper, as if through layers of static. "Lily, you are holding the frame. Not to complete the shape, but to prevent it from having a shape. Sometimes it's not the sewer who creates the entity, but the one who holds the frame, keeping the thread from moving forward. Don't undo it. Don't embroider. Hold the frame. Because everything is coming back, just needs one loop." At the end of the recording, a very strange waveform appeared, forming a shape resembling a round embroidery hoop, but the edges were cracking. Lily zoomed in on the image. The frame was not closed. It looked like a mouth, a jaw opening, preparing for the final note. 3 days later, Lily drove her old car over 800 miles southeast, returning to the swamp area where her family had moved when she was 9 years old. Where everything began. Where the white dress once dried in the early mist, and a nameless soul whispered behind every fold of fabric. The house was abandoned. Moss covered the wooden walls. The steps were rotten underfoot. But the attic remained exactly the same, as if time had circled around it without touching it. She brought the embroidery hoop with her, the only thing left. Not just to return it to its origin, but to see if that fragment of memory was truly buried, or just waiting to be sewn back. When she stepped inside, Lily immediately felt there was no sound. No birds. No insects. No wind through the door. Only a silent thing spreading in the air. The sound of threads pulling themselves out of the wood. She went up to the second floor, where her bedroom used to be. The left wall, once painted ivory white, was now covered in cracks like a spider web. But if you looked closely, the cracks were not random. They started from a point in the middle of the wall, extending outward like an overly stretched stitch, then bursting. On the floor, there were old threads, ashen gray, pale red, arranged in an unfinished embroidery shape. Lily immediately recognized this was the final embroidery her mother had drawn in her notebook, but never completed. It was the shape of 2 hands, one sewing, one covering the eyes. But now, the remaining fragment, in the center, was completing itself. No hands. Only a damp stain, little by little, taking shape according to the movement, as if the room was remembering itself. She placed the embroidery hoop down, aligning it with the circle of the stain on the floor. It matched perfectly. The hoop fit snugly within the stain shape, as if it had never been taken away. As if the house was reclaiming what belonged to it. The sound of the wind began to echo, this time not Asher. No one called a name. No one asked to borrow one more night. Only sounds interrupted like a knife-cutting thread. Then a voice echoed from downstairs, Lily's own voice, but younger, shakier. If I stay silent, can you still undo it for me? She froze, closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she answered, no. But I can sew it wrong, to prevent it from taking shape. Not every thread line has to be completed. A thread stopping at the right time is life. Lily sat down on the dusty floor. The dim light from the attic window shone through the torn curtain, casting down on the embroidery hoop now sitting exactly in the middle of the stained shape, a memory mark that was never wiped clean. She took out a new thread, wine red, completely different from all the colors that had appeared in any of her mother's embroideries, her own, or in the nightmares that had once clung to her family. There was no pattern, no guide, only a decision. Embroider a straight line. The first needle pierced through the fabric surface. Nothing happened. The second stitch. A cold wind rushed through the closed gap in the door. The left wall emitted a sound like fabric being torn. By the third stitch, everything began to crack. The space around her didn't collapse as often seen in movies or nightmares. It separated, like fabric turned inside out. Each piece of the ceiling, walls, floor, turned into blurred slices, as if she was sitting in another version of the room, where every object was a distorted memory. On the walls, overlapping images appeared. A little girl in a white dress, sitting and embroidering by the window, not Lily, but someone else, dark hair, pale skin. Her mother, Elise, folding the dress Lily wore at age 9, but her face was covered by a broken lace layer. Daniel, her father, standing in front of the mirror, talking to himself in the form of another child. Each image was a wrong stitch that had been hidden. Not events, but the way the people involved remembered incorrectly, and kept it as truth. Lily plunged the fourth needle deep. And at that moment, a sound echoed from downstairs. Not footsteps. Not a human voice. But the sound of threads being pulled, scratching against the wood, as if thousands of stitches were pulling themselves out of the walls, out of the partitions, out of the skin, to escape. The opposite wall exploded into a spiral shape. From there, a tall, thin, undefined figure began to emerge, without eyes, without a mouth, just a piece of white fabric sewn shut with whispers. It didn't move. It just existed. But Lily knew. This was not Asher. This was the very mistake they had allowed to live. The sum of memories that were covered up, embellished, cut into pieces, then sewn back together distortedly. And for the first time, she didn't retreat. She plunged the final needle, the fifth stitch, and whispered, I don't remember to sew back. I remember to stop sewing. No shape. No name. No more. The space contracted. The memory slices turned to dust. The embroidery hoop caught fire from the center, but emitted no heat. Only the smell of old paper and moldy fabric. And silence. When Lily opened her eyes, she was still sitting in the room. Normal. Ceiling, walls, floor, everything was back. But on the broken embroidery hoop, there remained a single straight thread, dark-colored, not connected to any shape. 1 week later. The Whisper Horror Channel mailbox received a package from Portland, Oregon. No sender listed. Inside, a USB, a small piece of fabric with charred edges, and a strange embroidery. A single thread line, wine red, running straight across the white background. No curves, no patterns, no words. Attached was a handwritten note, written in faded blue ink. I am not retelling so that someone sees. I am sending this so that you know. There are memories that should only be kept silent by the very hand that once undid them. If you broadcast, stop where there is no shape. Don't add anything. Don't recreate anything. Because every silence has a limit. And that straight thread line is the final boundary. Signed, LC. The Whisper team opened the USB. Inside was an unedited audio recording. The voice of a woman, young, but tired, recounting the story from the swamp, from the white dress. From the first embroidery to the final embroidery hoop. No background music. No special effects. Just the narration. With pauses as if choking when memories surfaced. They did not edit it into an episode. Did not broadcast the whole thing. They only used a part, exactly 1 minute. To serve as the conclusion to the series, The Shapes That Were Never Drawn. A segment that Whisper had not broadcast again for 3 years. The broadcast ended with an empty frame. White background, no logo, no outro. Only a line of text appeared. Memory, if sown incorrectly, will take shape. But if kept silent, it will return to the earth. 1 month later, Whisper received hundreds of emails. People dreamed of a stitch running horizontally across their ears while sleeping. People heard a child's voice asking, "Should I keep this frame?" And notably, one person sent a photo. A circular water spiral appeared in a damp stain on their daughter's bedroom wall, even though the house had no water leaks. Whisper did not reply. Whisper did not rebroadcast that episode. And Whisper did not accept any more physical packages. But somewhere, in the small sewing studio of a woman named Lily Cromwell, there is still a broken embroidery hoop, hanging silently on the wooden wall. On it is the only red thread line, not connected to the past, nor leading to the future. Just a dividing line. So that no shape is completed again. So you have just listened to the story of the white shadow at the swamp. A dress. An embroidery hoop. A child who was never remembered correctly. And a mother, who chose not to retell everything, just to keep what was never formed, forever without the chance to be embroidered further. What do you think? Can an incorrect memory, if no one corrects it, become a living entity? Would you tell it, to make it vanish? Or keep it silent, and hope no one else accidentally sews it up? If you are still thinking, like to keep that cold feeling, share if you know someone who once held an incorrect memory. And subscribe to the Whisper Horror channel. Because next time, it might be you who hears the whisper from inside your own wall. Do you still hear the sound of the wind? It might just be the wind. Or it could be the sound of a stitch being threaded through memory.